It looked like a nightmare, but it was real. In January 1945, Soviet soldiers walked into Auschwitz and froze. In front of them stood children, thin as bones, their eyes wide with terror, their arms tattooed like cattle. Most were twins. Some couldn't walk, others couldn't speak. And all of them had been through something no child should ever face. These children were not just prisoners. They were lab rats. And worst of all, these kids were chosen for one reason. They were born twins. That was their crime. Their punishment was to be turned into experiments by a doctor who thought they were less than human. The war that allowed this to happen. The horror of the twin experiments didn't happen in a vacuum. It was born out of a war, World War II, and out of ideas so twisted that they turned science into a weapon. To understand why a doctor could walk into a room full of children and see test subjects instead of human beings, we have to step back into the world that made it possible. Germany in the 1930s was reeling. After losing World War I, the country was broke, humiliated, and angry. The Nazi Party promised to fix that. They didn't just want to rebuild Germany, they wanted to purify it. Adolf Hitler believed that some people were naturally better than others. At the top of his list were so-called Aryans, white, blonde, blue-eyed Germans. At the bottom were Jews, Roma, also called Gypsies, Slavs, people with disabilities, and anyone who didn't fit the Nazi mold of perfection. The Nazis didn't just hate these groups, they called them Untermenschen, a subhuman. That word mattered. Once you label someone as less than human, it becomes easier to hurt them, to isolate them, to kill them. Nazi propaganda hammered this idea home every day. Children were taught in school that Jews spread disease. Doctors were trained to spot inferior traits, like dark eyes, crooked noses, or mental illness. It wasn't just hate, it was policy. And that policy would soon lead to mass murder. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. The Nazis quickly overran much of Europe, dragging millions of people under their rule. And with that control came a deadly plan, the final solution. It was a code name for something horrible, the systematic extermination of Jews and other targeted groups. Ghettos were created to trap Jewish families. Deportations followed. And finally, there were the camps. Auschwitz-Birkenau wasn't just a camp, it was a machine built to kill. Located in occupied Poland, it became the largest of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps. Trains packed with people rolled in, day and night. Most were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arriving. Entire families were erased. But not everyone was killed immediately. Some were kept alive for labor. Strong men, younger women, those who looked fit enough to work. And then, there were the twins. Twins were rare, roughly 1 in every 100 births. But for Nazi scientists, they were gold. They believed twins held the key to understanding heredity, what traits were passed down in the blood, and what came from the environment. To them, identical twins were living experiments, ready to be measured, compared, and tortured in the name of research. So, when a transport arrived, Nazi officers would shout, "Zwillinge," twins, as families stepped off the cattle cars. If a mother had twin children, they were often pulled aside. The rest of the family, parents, grandparents, even older siblings, were sent to the gas chambers. Sometimes very young children were allowed to stay with the twins for a while, just to keep them calm. But eventually, they too disappeared. This practice didn't happen by accident. It was part of the Nazi obsession with eugenics. Eugenics is the idea that the human race can be improved by controlling who gets to have children. The Nazis believed that by breeding out traits like mental illness, physical disability, and even entire races, they could build a stronger, healthier society. But this wasn't science. It was a twisted fantasy. backed by fake experiments and forced sterilizations, and it was deadly. The idea didn't start in Germany. Eugenics had already taken hold in parts of the United States and Europe in the early 20th century, but the Nazis took it to terrifying extremes. They created policies that targeted people considered genetically unfit. Over 400,000 people in Germany were sterilized against their will. Tens of thousands with disabilities were murdered in secret. And in the occupied territories, it got even worse. When Auschwitz expanded to include Birkenau in 1942, it was designed not just for forced labor, but for industrial-scale killing. But amid all this death, a small number of people were chosen to live, for a purpose worse than death itself. They were taken not because they were lucky, but because they were valuable to one man's obsession. His name was Josef Mengele. Who was Dr. Josef Mengele? Josef Mengele did not arrive at Auschwitz as a monster. He came wearing a smile, polished boots, and a doctor's coat. He looked clean and confident, like someone who might help the sick. But underneath the uniform was a man who had already decided that some children were worth less than lab mice. To understand how he got there, how one man came to decide the fate of thousands of twins, we have to look at where he came from. Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, a small town in southern Germany. His family was Catholic and well-off. His father, Karl Mengele, owned a successful farm equipment company called Mengele & Sons. The business gave Joseph a privileged childhood, far from hunger or struggle. He was the oldest of 3 boys, and his parents expected great things from him. As a student, Joseph was bright. He loved music and art, but science captured his imagination. In the 1930s, he enrolled at the University of Munich, a place that had already become a center for Nazi ideology. He then studied anthropology and medicine at the University of Frankfurt. There, he met one of the key figures who shaped his thinking, Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer. Verschuer was a respected scientist, but also a committed eugenicist. He believed that people could be ranked by race and genetics. He taught that some were naturally superior and others naturally flawed. He was especially interested in twins, believing they could help unlock the secrets of heredity. Mengele became his assistant, and later, his protege. By 1935, Josef Mengele had earned a PhD in physical anthropology. His dissertation focused on how jaw structure could differ between races. A few years later, in 1938, he completed his medical degree. That same year, he joined the SS, the elite paramilitary group under Hitler's command. And in 1937, even before earning his MD, Mengele officially joined the Nazi Party. He wasn't forced into it. He wasn't brainwashed. He actually believed in it. When war broke out in 1939, Mengele volunteered for the Waffen-SS and served on the Eastern Front. In 1942, he was badly injured and declared unfit for frontline duty. That's when his career changed. Instead of fighting, he would research. Instead of a battlefield, he would get a lab and a camp full of victims. In May 1943, Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. He quickly rose to become the chief physician of the Romani or Gypsy camp, and later one of the main doctors overseeing selections at the train ramp. But Mengele wasn't interested in just any prisoner. He was looking for twins, identical ones if possible. His old mentor, Verschuer, had stayed behind in Germany and still worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics. Mengele wanted to impress him, and to go even further. At Auschwitz, Mengele found what he'd always wanted, an endless supply of human test subjects, and no one to stop him. No ethics board, no consequences, just children, stripped of their rights, ready to be measured, injected, and cut apart. He had charm. That's what many survivors remember, and what made him so dangerous. He was always well-dressed, clean-shaven, and polite. He smiled. He made jokes. He played classical music. Some of the children called him Uncle Mengele because he would bring them candy or toys. But it was a mask, a performance. Behind closed doors, he became something else entirely. The selection ramp. It began the moment the train doors slid open. Prisoners who had survived the suffocating cattle cars stumbled onto a long concrete platform. This was the selection ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the place where millions took their last steps as free human beings. The platform was flanked by guards, dogs, and SS officers. There was no warning, no explanation. Just screaming, barking, shouting. And the man who controlled it all stood calmly in the middle, his hand resting on a riding crop. Dr. Mengele didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply raised a finger, left or right. To the left, death. Gas chambers, crematoria, smoke. To the right, work for those who looked strong enough. But for some, usually children, there was another fate. If they happened to be twins, they weren't sent to die. They were taken aside, separated from the crowd, and marked for something worse. Mengele had a keen eye for twins. He trained himself to spot them within seconds. If he saw two children who looked alike, even roughly, he would call out Zwillinge, the German word for twins. Sometimes it came as a question, sometimes a command. Parents were terrified. Some tried to lie, saying their children weren't twins. Others hoped it meant safety and spoke up. A few simply broke down, unsure whether silence or truth would mean life. Once identified, the twins were pulled from the line. They were told they were special, that they would not be harmed, that they were going to school. Some were even told they were going to meet a real doctor who would help them. This lie, repeated often, was part of the cruelty. It gave hope when there was none. The moment of separation was always brutal. Many children were taken screaming from their mothers. If the parents resisted, they were beaten or shot. Most adults, mothers, fathers, grandparents, were sent directly to the gas chambers. The smoke from the crematoria was always rising, always nearby. For the twins, the trauma didn't end with separation. It was only the beginning. Some mothers were kept alive a little longer, especially if Mengele believed their bodies could be useful for other medical procedures. But this was never for long. When the SS were done with them, they were killed quietly, without trial or record. Their children were now alone, stripped of everything: family, clothes, names. Mengele didn't always need to be on duty to find what he wanted. Survivors recalled that he often showed up on the ramp even when he wasn't scheduled to be there. He walked with a sense of ease, as if shopping for something interesting. He would pass by lines of frightened people and pause only for twins, dwarves, or anyone with an unusual appearance. Heterochromia, two different eye colors, was a favorite. Dwarfism, a cleft lip. Anything rare was valuable to him. When Mengele chose a child, he would sometimes smile, touch their hair, ask them their name. To a watching mother, it might look like mercy, but to those who survived, that smile was the mask of death. It meant their child would be subjected to procedures too cruel to imagine, all under the title of research. In the records, these selections were not written down as crimes. No laws were broken, because in Nazi Germany, the law had already declared Jews, Roma, and disabled people as subhuman, stripped of citizenship, stripped of protection, and most importantly, stripped of value, except as test subjects. Survivors say Mengele never looked nervous. He never seemed in a rush. He moved with the confidence of someone who believed history was on his side. When he saw a pair of twins, he saw a key to the future. His future. A world shaped by science, where some genes would be preserved and others erased. The ramp was more than a sorting area. It was a funnel, designed to separate bodies from hope. Some were sent to die immediately. Others, like the twins, were set aside for special use. They were marched away from their parents into separate barracks. There, they would begin a new chapter as Mengeles children. None of them knew what was coming. But the guards did. And so did Mengele. The horrors of the experiments. At Auschwitz, the children chosen by Dr. Mengele were not allowed to grow up. They were not allowed to be children. They were turned into living scientific experiments, cut, injected, measured, and compared. Between 1943 and 1945, roughly 3,000 twins passed through his hands. Fewer than 200 are known to have survived. These twins came from all over Europe: Hungarian Jews, Roma children from Poland, Greek siblings, Czech girls and boys. Some were toddlers who could barely walk. Others were in their early teens. But the moment they were selected, they were no longer sons or daughters. They were no longer people. They became known as Mengeles children. Conditions inside their barracks were filthy. The floors were hard. The air stank of urine, mold, and rotting flesh. The children were bitten constantly by lice and fleas. Rats scurried across the beds at night. Hunger was constant. Each child was given slightly more food than the others in Auschwitz. Enough to keep them alive, but not enough to be full. Mengele didn't want them strong. He wanted them stable, predictable, testable. Their identities were erased and replaced with tattoos, rows of numbers burned into their skin with ink and needles. These weren't the same numbers used for regular prisoners. Mengeles children were given special codes so they could be tracked. He didn't care about their names. He cared about their blood types, their measurements, their results. They didn't have to do hard labor like digging ditches or carrying bricks. Their work was to survive the experiments. 6 days a week, sometimes 7, they were called to the lab. Not in groups of adults, but as pairs. Everything was done with one twin next to the other. At first, many of them were confused. Mengele greeted them with smiles. He wore a clean uniform, shiny boots, and sometimes a white doctor's coat. He looked neat, calm. He would bend down and ask their names. He would give candy. He might touch their hair or compliment their eyes. Some children began to call him Uncle Mengele. To someone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like kindness, but it was a trick. The calm face, the gifts, the music. Mengele played the violin in front of the children. Were all masks for what came next. Once inside the lab, the tone changed. The children were stripped naked. Not once. Every day. Every single child had to stand naked while doctors took notes. They were measured with metal tools and rulers. The length of their arms, the width of their skulls, the size of their noses, even their genitals. The doctors documented these details obsessively. If a twin cried, they were slapped. If they resisted, they were beaten. No one cared about their feelings. Mengele believed these measurements could reveal something deep about genetics. He wanted to prove that Aryan features were superior. He compared one twin to the other, again and again, looking for patterns. The goal wasn't health. It was racial science. It was eugenics. On alternating days, they were taken to what survivors called the blood lab. There, children were tied down. Needles were pushed into both arms, and blood was drawn out by the pint. Sometimes it took over an hour. One survivor, Eva Kor, said her arms were so bruised from the needles that she couldn't lift them. Sometimes, when they were finished with the drawing, they performed transfusions. In these transfusions, blood was taken from one twin and pumped into the other. Mengele didn't care if their blood types matched. He was curious about the results. Could one child survive on the blood of another? What would happen to the heart? Would they get sick? Would they die? They did. Some of them collapsed after the transfusions and never woke up. Others suffered fevers and infections that lasted for days. Most of them became so weak and dizzy they couldn't stand. And this was only the beginning. Not all the suffering in Mengele's lab was visible from the outside. Some of the worst pain came from what was hidden beneath the skin: injections, chemicals, and diseases that broke the body from the inside out. The children were test subjects for poisons, viruses, and bacteria, often injected without explanation. The goal was to see what happened. Not to heal, but to harm. Eva Kor, one of the most well-known survivors, recalled a moment when she and her sister Miriam were taken into the lab without warning. A nurse tied her down and stuck a large needle into her arm. Whatever they injected into her caused her to burn with fever almost instantly. Her body convulsed, her muscles locked. She could barely breathe. For days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. Nurses recorded her temperature, 40 degrees Celsius, sometimes higher. Mengele came in, looked at her chart, and said calmly, "She has 2 weeks to live." Then he left. She survived, but the injections left damage that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Decades later, doctors still couldn't identify what had been in those needles. It could have been typhus. It might have been tuberculosis or something experimental, maybe even a chemical cocktail designed to imitate disease. Nobody knows. Mengele kept no public records. His notes, if they ever existed, were never recovered after the war. Often, one twin was injected, while the other was kept in good health. If the sick one died, the healthy one was immediately killed, sometimes within minutes. Autopsies would follow. Mengele wanted to compare their organs, the treated child versus the control. To him, they were not people, they were samples. One of Mengele's favorite obsessions was eye color. He believed that Aryans, the so-called master race, should have blue eyes. Many of the children he selected had brown or hazel eyes. That, to him, was a problem to solve. In his lab, children were strapped down while assistants injected colored dyes and chemical solutions directly into their eyeballs. These chemicals were supposed to alter the pigment, to turn brown into blue. The procedures didn't work. Instead, they caused horrific pain. The chemicals burned through the eye tissue, damaging retinas and corneas. Some children went blind. Some developed terrible infections that caused the eyes to swell or rot. Those who died had their eyes removed and preserved. According to multiple testimonies, Mengele kept a wall of these eyes. Glass jars lined the shelves, filled with human eyes, brown, blue, green, all suspended in liquid. He displayed them like trophies. Then came the deliberate infections. Children were exposed to deadly diseases, sometimes through injections, sometimes through cuts that were purposely left open. Noma disease, which causes rotting flesh on the face and genitals, was one of them. Typhus, tuberculosis, and gangrene were also introduced on purpose. The aim was not to treat, but to observe the suffering, to see how long a child would live, to see which twin died first. Once one was gone, the other was killed for comparison. Surgery was another nightmare, except this time, there was no anesthesia. Some children were cut open while fully conscious. Internal organs were removed or rearranged. Livers, kidneys, and spleens were tampered with. Some children were sterilized, boys and girls both. Others were castrated. The genital mutilation of young boys was especially cruel. Mengele also tried hormone manipulation, injecting testosterone into girls and estrogen into boys, trying to force sex changes. It was all untested. It was all guesswork. But the pain was real, and the damage was permanent. The worst of all may have been the Sohn twins, the so-called Siamese experiments. Vera Alexander, a Jewish survivor, remembered 2 Roma children she helped care for. One day, they were taken away. When they came back, they had been sewn together. Their backs were stitched from shoulder to hip. Blood vessels had been joined. They were in agony, screaming until they died a few days later. Their wounds festered. The smell of infection filled the room. There was no medicine, no comfort, no chance to survive. Other survivors, including Eva Kor and Vera Kriegel, described similar stories. Kriegel recalled children with their veins connected by tubes. In one case, when a child died, their sibling was dragged away to be finished off with an injection of chloroform, directly into the heart. That was Mengele's final act. When a twin was no longer useful, if they got sick, if they didn't recover fast enough, or if he simply wanted to end the experiment, he would end their life with a single shot of poison to the chest. Chloroform, or sometimes phenol. Quick, clean, cold. And when one died, the other followed. They had to. So he could open their bodies and take notes. In one night, according to survivor accounts, 14 twins were killed this way. A quiet purge. The next morning, the beds were empty. The experiments never led to real science. There were no discoveries, no treatments, no cures. What Mengele did was not research. It was torture disguised as medicine. Voices of the survivors. When the Soviet soldiers opened the gates of Auschwitz in January 1945, they found the children Mengele had left behind. Starved, sick, and barely alive, these twins stood with shaved heads, tattooed arms, and hollow stares. They were free, but broken. The physical pain would ease with time. The mental scars never fully healed. These survivors went on to live their lives, but the past stayed inside them. Some stayed silent for decades. Others spoke out, hoping their stories might warn the world. Each voice is a reminder of what was done and what was nearly forgotten. Eva Kor and her twin sister Miriam were just 10 years old when they arrived in Auschwitz. Their parents and 2 older sisters were killed in the gas chambers within hours. The girls were pulled from the selection ramp and added to Mengele's collection of twins. What followed were months of injections, experiments, and terror. Eva remembers collapsing from a high fever after being injected with an unknown substance. Mengele looked at her chart and coldly predicted she'd be dead in 2 weeks. While Eva lay sick in the barracks, Miriam was separated and held in isolation. The plan was cruel and precise. If Eva died, Miriam would be killed for dissection. She would become the final control sample. But Eva didn't die. She forced herself to survive. Her fever broke after 2 weeks. When she saw Miriam again, her sister was thin, pale, and quiet. For decades, Miriam refused to talk about what had happened. It wasn't until 1985, 40 years later, that the sisters finally shared their stories publicly. Eva later founded the Candles Holocaust Museum in Indiana to educate others about Mengele's experiments and to connect with other surviving twins. But the damage couldn't be reversed. Miriam developed severe kidney problems in adulthood, which Eva believed were caused by the experiments. In 1993, Miriam died from a kidney-related illness. Eva continued speaking until her death in 2019, traveling the world to tell people what happened and to fight for memory, justice, and understanding. Jonah Lax was another child pulled into Mengele's lab. She remembered being terrified when her twin sister was taken from her. Some children never came back. Others returned mutilated or sick. Yona survived while many around her were dissected. One of her clearest memories was of Mengele's collection of human eyes. They were kept in glass jars on a wall. Blue, green, brown, eyes stolen from the children who died on his table. To Yona, they weren't just body parts. They were witnesses, silent, floating reminders of every friend who didn't make it out alive. Vera and Olga Kriegel were twin girls from Czechoslovakia. Vera remembered one of the most disturbing experiments, being injected with a bacteria that caused a rotting flesh infection. Her legs swelled. Her skin turned dark and raw. The pain was unbearable. Like other twins, she was given just enough food to keep her alive, but nothing to help her heal. Olga, her sister, suffered alongside her, and the two girls leaned on each other to survive. Vera also recalled Mengeles' gallery of body parts, especially the wall of preserved eyes. It haunted her dreams for years. Menachem Bodner didn't even know his name until decades later. He left Auschwitz as a lost child. His real name, his birthday, his family, everything had been stripped away. For years, he lived with the number A7734 tattooed on his arm, unsure who he was or where he belonged. In the 2000s, with the help of researchers and digital databases, he tracked down his identity and even found surviving relatives. He had been one of Mengeles' twins. His story, like many others, had nearly vanished in the fog of war. Renee and Irene Gutmann were just toddlers when they were taken to Auschwitz. After the war, they were adopted and raised in the United States. For a long time, they didn't talk about what happened. They knew they had survived something, but the memories were hazy, painful, and buried. Renee once said, "We never felt normal. There was always something missing." As adults, they began to speak out. The silence broke, and they started piecing together the past. These survivors didn't ask to become symbols. They didn't want fame. They wanted answers, justice, and peace. Some never fully got any of those things. But by telling their stories, they ensured that what happened in Mengeles' lab would never be erased. Their voices were fragile but powerful. They turned memory into warning. And for every child who spoke, there were hundreds who didn't get the chance. The science behind the savagery. Dr. Josef Mengele called the horrible experiment a science. He wore a white coat, carried a clipboard, and scribbled notes during his experiments like a man chasing knowledge. But what he practiced at Auschwitz wasn't medicine. It wasn't science. It was cruelty, dressed up in the language of research. Mengele believed identical twins were the key to unlocking the mysteries of genetics. He thought that by studying their bodies, how they grew, how they got sick, how they died, he could prove something much bigger. He wanted to prove that some people were genetically superior. In his mind, the so-called Aryan race, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, were biologically better than everyone else. Jews, Roma, Slavs, people with disabilities. He believed these groups were defective, and he thought his research would support that belief. This obsession didn't start with him. Mengele studied under a man named Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a respected German scientist who worked at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Frankfurt. Verschuer was a leading figure in the field of racial hygiene, a form of eugenics that had taken hold in Nazi Germany. Eugenics claimed that human traits, intelligence, beauty, health, could be controlled through breeding, just like livestock. The goal was to make sure the fit reproduced while the unfit were sterilized, killed, or prevented from passing on their genes. Under the Nazis, this became policy. By the time Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, the machinery of mass murder was already running. Gas chambers, crematoria, and starvation were part of daily life. But Mengele saw something else in the camp, an opportunity. There, he had an endless supply of human subjects. He didn't need to get approval. He didn't need to follow ethical rules. He didn't even have to worry if his subjects died. And most of them did. twins were especially important to his so-called research. In his twisted logic, they offered the perfect natural laboratory. If one twin was injected with a disease, the other could be used as a control. If one twin was killed, their body could be compared to the survivor. Mengele believed that by comparing organs, responses to illness, and other physical features, he could understand the secrets of heredity. He thought he could isolate the Jewish gene or prove that Roma people were genetically inferior. He thought his work would earn him recognition in Germany's scientific world, and he wanted to be famous. Verschuer, still back in Frankfurt, was deeply involved. He received reports from Mengele. He also received samples, organs, eyes, blood, and tissue taken from children killed in Auschwitz. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a supply chain of death, with Mengele on one end and respected doctors on the other. Today, many historians believe that Mengele's name was scrubbed from official records by Verschuer to avoid post-war prosecution. But for all the horror, there was no science. Modern geneticists who have studied the records say Mengele's experiments were sloppy, unorganized, and medically useless. He didn't follow any real scientific method. He kept poor records, he changed variables without documentation, and most of all, his results were based on torture and murder, which no ethical researcher would ever accept as valid. The twins were not examined in ways that could provide real genetic insight. They were cut, injected, and starved. Their organs were harvested after death and sent to labs, but the data was never used to help anyone. No scientific papers were published, no breakthroughs were made. What Mengele left behind was not knowledge, it was pain. Even by the standards of his time, Mengele's work was a disgrace. In 1947, the Nuremberg doctors' trial established the idea of informed consent in medical experiments. The Nuremberg Code was written in direct response to what Nazi doctors, including Mengele, had done. It stated clearly that experiments must have scientific value and that human subjects must agree to participate. Mengele violated every part of this principle. His patients were children who could not consent. He harmed them deliberately, and his goals were rooted in racial hatred, not discovery. Still, some of his mentors and fellow researchers continued working after the war. Verschuer, for example, was never charged with war crimes. He returned to academic life in Germany. He even received public honors in the 1950s. The institutions that supported Mengele's work quietly rebranded themselves. And the victims, the children who had their blood drained, their organs removed, their lives shattered, were mostly forgotten. Mengele's escape and post-war cover-up. When the war ended in 1945, Josef Mengele vanished into the chaos like smoke. He had overseen some of the most horrifying crimes at Auschwitz, crimes that left children scarred, crippled, or dead. But he was never put on trial. The man known as the Angel of Death would not face justice. Not in Nuremberg. Not in Germany. Not ever. In the spring of 1945, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, Mengele was captured by American forces near the town of Rosenheim in Bavaria. He had discarded his SS uniform and was posing as a low-ranking soldier. He was held in a U.S. detention camp under the name Josef Mengele, but no one realized who he was. One reason he slipped through was because he didn't have the telltale SS blood group tattoo on his arm, something most SS members had. Whether he never received it or had it removed remains unclear. What is clear is that the Americans let him go. After his release, Mengele went into hiding. He stayed in Bavaria for several years, living under false names and relying on Nazi sympathizers who provided shelter. The post-war years in Germany were chaotic. Millions of displaced people were trying to return home or rebuild their lives. Former Nazis blended in with refugees. In this confusion, Mengele disappeared easily. By 1949, he made his way to Italy and secured a Red Cross passport under the name Helmut Gregor. From there, he boarded a ship to Argentina. At that time, Argentina under President Juan Perón had become a safe haven for Nazis and fascist collaborators. Men like Adolf Eichmann and Klaus Barbie were already settling into new lives there. Mengele joined them. He lived comfortably in Buenos Aires for a time, even under his real name. He worked as a carpenter, a salesman, and later a business consultant. In photos from this period, he appears relaxed, dressed well, smiling, surrounded by friends. The past, it seemed, was behind him. But it wasn't. Survivors began identifying him in newspaper interviews and public testimonies. International pressure grew. In 1959, West Germany issued a warrant for his arrest. Interpol listed him as one of the most wanted men in the world, but no one came to take him. He remained untouched. Part of the reason Mengele stayed free was the support of his family. The Mengele family, back in the Bavarian town of Günzburg, ran a thriving farm equipment business called Karl Mengele and Sons. They had made their fortune during the war and continued to grow after it. They knew exactly where Josef was and sent him money regularly. They also helped manage his identity, passing messages through lawyers and trusted friends. The family never disowned him. In fact, they used the Mengele name proudly in their business long after the war. Tractors, plows, and other equipment bore the Mengele logo. It wasn't a secret. It was just ignored. In the early 1960s, Mengele moved to Paraguay and obtained citizenship under dictator Alfredo Stroessner, another protector of fugitive Nazis. But after Eichmann was kidnapped by Israeli agents in 1960 and put on trial in Jerusalem, Mengele got nervous. He fled again, this time to Brazil. There he lived under the name Wolfgang Gerhard in a small town called Embu, just outside São Paulo. A wealthy Hungarian exile named Geza and his wife Gita Stammer gave him shelter. In exchange, Mengele acted as their family physician and tutor. Even as global outrage grew and his name appeared in war crimes reports, Mengele stayed hidden in plain sight. In 1977, his only son, Rolf Mengele, visited him in Brazil. Rolf was a lawyer, and by then, he knew the full truth of his father's crimes. He later described the meeting in detail. He said his father showed no remorse. Mengele defended his actions, claiming he had only followed orders. He didn't see himself as a criminal. He thought of himself as a scientist. 2 years later, in 1979, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach in Bertioga, Brazil. He drowned. His body was buried under a false name. For years, rumors swirled. Some said he was still alive, hiding in Paraguay or protected by secret networks. In 1985, German authorities tracked down his grave in Brazil. They exhumed the body and tested the remains. In 1992, DNA analysis confirmed the skeleton was Mengele. The angel of death was dead, but he had escaped trial. He had never been handcuffed, never faced a courtroom, never heard a verdict. Even in death, his family did not express shame. In Günzburg, the Mengele business continued for years. The name stayed on the building. The town refused to discuss its most infamous son. There was no plaque, no memorial, no apology. Legacy, silence, and stirrings of justice. When Josef Mengele died in 1979, it did not close the story. It opened new questions. How did he escape for so long? Who helped him? And what happened to all the records from his experiments? Many survivors believed that Mengele kept detailed notes. He was often seen scribbling during the experiments, recording the children's reactions, fevers, measurements, even the time it took them to die. He filed reports to his mentor, Ottmar von Verschuer, back in Germany. Yet when the war ended, those documents vanished. Some believe the Soviets took them. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they seized many Nazi files. Soviet intelligence was known to collect documents for their own use, sometimes never sharing them. Today, researchers suspect that Mengeles records may still exist somewhere in a Russian archive. If they do, they've never been made public. Some Holocaust historians have pleaded with Moscow to open its files, hoping that long-lost medical notes, letters, or autopsy results might offer more answers about what Mengele did to those children. So far, those requests have gone unanswered. Without those documents, survivors have had to carry the truth on their own. And in the early decades after the war, very few people wanted to hear it. In Germany, Mengele's name was rarely spoken. His family continued to live in comfort. His business, Carl Mengele and Sons, thrived in post-war West Germany, and no one in the town of Günzburg wanted to talk about it. The German justice system also failed to act. During the 1950s and 60s, prosecutors like Hans Klein in Frankfurt tried to bring cases against former SS doctors and guards. But they ran into limits. Laws at the time required specific evidence that linked a suspect directly to a murder. General involvement in a system of killing wasn't enough. And in Mengele's case, most of the witnesses were children at the time of the crime. Many were dead. Others had no documents to support their memories. There were no charges against Mengele's family. No charges against the men who forwarded his mail, who handled his bank transfers, who helped keep his whereabouts a secret. West German courts claimed they didn't have the legal grounds to prosecute them. The result was silence, not just in courtrooms, but across the entire country. That silence began to break in the 1980s. As survivors entered middle age, many of them began speaking out. Some had been silent for decades. The memories were too painful, the trauma too deep. But something began to shift. The world, now several generations removed from the Holocaust, was finally starting to listen. Eva Kor, who survived Mengele's experiments along with her twin sister Miriam, became one of the loudest voices. In 1984, she founded the CANDLES Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Indiana. CANDLES stood for Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiment Survivors. Her goal was to find others like her, those who had lived through the twin experiments, and preserve their stories. She found more than 100. They came from Hungary, Poland, Israel, the United States, South America. Most had never spoken publicly before. When they met each other, many broke down in tears. Some had not seen another surviving twin since Auschwitz. For many, it was the first time they truly felt understood. Their testimonies were often the same: being separated from parents, forced to strip naked, measured, injected, starved. Many had no idea what was done to them. They only knew the pain, the burning fevers, the swelling, the blood loss. They spoke of losing siblings who had been dissected, of being given sugar cubes by Uncle Mengele one day and nearly dying the next. Even decades later, many carried physical scars. Eva Kor had a damaged immune system and developed multiple infections throughout her life. Others lost organs, had missing teeth, or bore surgical marks that had never been explained. Mentally, the wounds were even deeper. Nightmares, flashbacks, shame, a deep fear of hospitals and doctors, and for some, survivors' guilt that never faded. Despite this, they spoke, in classrooms, in books, on television. Some took legal action. They submitted affidavits, gave interviews, begged the German government to investigate further. But without documents, without living perpetrators, most cases went nowhere. Mengele's name became a symbol of medical evil, of scientific abuse, of unchecked power. But justice, in the legal sense, never came. The best survivors could do was remember and warn. The world remembers. For a long time, the children Mengele experimented on were forgotten. They had no graves, no tombstones. Most of their names were never recorded. But over time, that silence started to break. In the 1980s, people began to speak, to write, to remember. The horror was too great to stay hidden forever. One of the first major efforts to bring these stories to light came in 1986, when author Lucette Matalon-Lagnado and journalist Sheila Cohn-Deckel published the book Children of the Flames. The book was based on years of interviews with survivors of Mengeles' twin experiments, people like Eva Kor, Yona Lax, and Menachem Bodner. It told in detail what happened to the children of Auschwitz: the infections, the surgeries, the loneliness, the grief. It also explained how Mengele escaped and how his network of support kept him protected for decades. The title said it all. These were children pulled from the flames of the gas chambers, only to face a slower death through science, or, in rare cases, a broken life lived in the shadow of what they endured. The book shocked readers. It was translated into many languages and became a key part of Holocaust education. It was later turned into a documentary film, sharing footage of survivors recounting their pain, their memories, and the faces they could never forget. One survivor described standing in a hospital room, watching his twin's body torn apart for an autopsy. Another remembered the exact taste of the sugar cube Mengele gave her the day before she almost died from an injection. These were not vague stories. These were precise, physical, real. As these testimonies spread, museums began adding them to their archives. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. now holds records from many of the survivors: photos, interviews, medical records when available. The museum also includes detailed displays about Mengeles' experiments and Nazi medical crimes in general. In Israel, Yad Vashem recognized many of the twin survivors and added their accounts to its testimony collections. In Germany, smaller memorials slowly began to appear. The town of Günzburg, Mengeles' hometown, resisted for decades but eventually allowed public discussion of his past. Not everyone welcomed it, but the silence was no longer absolute. Survivors themselves led the charge. Eva Kor's Candles Holocaust Museum, based in Terre Haute, Indiana, became a hub for learning. School groups visited regularly. Survivors gave talks. Exhibits showed photos of children in the twin barracks. The museum didn't just speak of death, it focused on survival. It showed how even after the worst horrors, some managed to live, remember, and teach others. But as the memory of Auschwitz was finally taking hold, something else began to rise. All across Europe, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, far-right political parties began gaining traction again. Some waved old nationalist symbols. Others questioned historical facts. Holocaust denial, once pushed to the fringes, began to show up online, in pamphlets, and even in political speeches. Survivors were alarmed. Eva Kor, in one of her later interviews, said it felt like the world was forgetting again. In France, Germany, Hungary, and Poland, Jewish cemeteries were vandalized. Swastikas were painted on synagogues, and far-right groups claimed the Holocaust was exaggerated or used for political gain. In Hungary, the birthplace of many of Mengeles' twins, some politicians downplayed their nation's role in deporting Jews. In Poland, a controversial law was passed, making it a crime to accuse the Polish state of collaborating in Nazi crimes, despite the fact that Auschwitz is located on Polish soil, and many locals had witnessed the deportations. In response, survivors raised their voices louder. School visits increased. Survivor-led programs trained educators on how to teach the Holocaust to new generations. Museums expanded their outreach online. The focus was not just on remembering the past, but on fighting the lies of the present. Despite this, time was running out. By the 2000s, most of the Mengele twins were gone. Many had died of complications from the experiments, others from old age. A few were still traveling, still giving talks, still trying to explain what had happened behind those barbed wire fences. But they knew their time was short. In 2019, Eva Kor passed away while on a trip to Poland, visiting Auschwitz one last time. She died in her sleep, not far from the camp where she once faced death every day. Her ashes were later buried near the museum she founded. She had once said, "If I die in Auschwitz, I'll be the happiest person. Because I came back, I forgave, and I lived." She, and others like her, made sure the world would not forget. Even now, new generations carry their story. Students read Children of the Flames. Visitors stand silent in front of the twin barracks. Historians continue digging, hoping to find Mengele's lost records. And in classrooms, survivors' voices are played through video, their words as chilling as ever. The experiments are over. Mengele is dead. But the memory lives. And memory, the survivors always said, is the strongest form of justice.